Like like he was not breathing. So I nudged him like, babe, wake up. And then he'd catch his breath. I'm like, dude, you just stopped breathing in your sleep. And I saved him.
There's an image of Shaquille O'Neal that the world decided on a long time ago and has never really let go of. 7 feet, 1 inch of absolute physical authority. A man who did not simply play basketball, but imposed himself on the game in a way that forced the sport to change its rules just to slow him down. The highlights still exist. The championships still count. The backboards he shattered are still part of the mythology. But behind that image in 2026, a very different story is unfolding. One that has nothing to do with opponents on a court and everything to do with the long, accumulated cost of having once been the most physically dominant athlete on the planet. The chronic pain arrived the way it always does in athletes who played at that level and that size. Not all at once, but gradually, building across years until one day it was simply there in every movement. His hips, his knees, the entire lower half of a body that spent 19 years absorbing collisions with the largest and strongest men in professional basketball. Every jump involved physics that his frame was never going to escape without consequence. Every landing sent force through joints that were already working beyond normal limits just by carrying his weight across a floor. What the television cameras framed as dominance was also, simultaneously, a slow structural dismantling happening underneath the surface. The body was running a tab the whole time, and retirement did not close it. It just meant there were no more reasons to ignore it. At 7 feet and 325 pounds during his playing years, Shaquille O'Neal generated forces through his joints that most orthopedic specialists would have considered extraordinary even in a controlled setting. In an NBA game, repeated dozens of times a night across an 82-game season for nearly 2 decades, those forces accumulated into something that no level of wealth or fame can simply undo. The hip replacement surgery that eventually became necessary was not a surprise to anyone who understood the arithmetic of what his career had physically demanded. What he has said since that surgery is more revealing than the surgery itself. He no longer attempts high-impact movements. He does not rush. He does not push through discomfort the way he once pushed through defenders. Every step in his daily life is now considered rather than instinctive. The body that once felt like an inexhaustible weapon has become something he manages with patience and genuine care, because he has learned that it will not forgive carelessness the way it once seemed to absorb everything without complaint. The sleep apnea diagnosis added another layer of complexity to a physical reality that was already demanding more attention than he had spent most of his life giving it. Sleep apnea means that breathing during rest becomes unreliable, that the body does not recover the way sleep is supposed to allow it to, and that something as fundamental as a night's rest requires medical equipment and careful management. A breathing machine became part of his nightly routine, a detail that sits in strange contrast to the image of a man who once seemed to operate on a completely different physical plane from everyone around him. But this is the honesty that elite athletic careers eventually demand from the people who live them. The body kept the score the whole time, and the reckoning is not optional. The weight fluctuations over the years compounded everything. Post-retirement life changes the body's relationship with the extreme conditioning that professional sport enforced, and for a man of his size, shifts in body weight carry consequences that scale differently than they do for a smaller person. Extra weight in his frame means extra pressure on joints already worn thin, extra difficulty for a cardiovascular system managing sleep apnea, extra demand on a body that was already managing more than most. Doctors were direct about what the numbers meant and what would happen if the trajectory continued unchecked. The warning was not gentle. The adjustments it required were not optional. For someone who had spent his entire public life being described as Superman, sitting across a desk from a physician who was telling him his body needed to be treated with serious care rather than pushed to its limits was not a comfortable experience. But it was a necessary one. What makes Shaquille O'Neal's post-basketball story more than just a physical health narrative is the way the quiet retirement revealed things that the noise of an active career had been covering. He built a second empire after the NBA with a discipline and intelligence that surprised people who assumed athletes simply fade when the game ends. Restaurant franchises, brand partnerships, media appearances, endorsements, business investments across multiple industries. He moved from locker rooms to boardrooms without losing competitive drive that had made him dominant on the court. The financial success is real and substantial, But money turned out to be a specific kind of answer to a specific kind of question, and the questions retirement asked him were not always the ones money could resolve. The large homes that success had built sometimes felt exactly as large and quiet as they were. The mornings that used to begin with team meetings and game preparation slowed into something different, more reflective, more still, more aware of what was present and what was absent. The roaring energy of packed arenas and the constant motion of an NBA career created a kind of noise that, once removed, left something unexpected in its place. He was still recognizable everywhere he went. The world still knew his name. But the daily experience of being Shaquille O'Neal had shifted into something quieter and more complicated than the public version of his life suggested. Fame, it turned out, could coexist quite comfortably with solitude, and the distinction between the two was not something you could see from the outside. His marriage to Shawnee Nelson ended in divorce after years that carried a particular strain of a life always in motion, always demanded, always somewhere else. The NBA career meant extended time away from home. The business empire that followed meant more of the same, different in its details, but similar in its basic structure. A man whose schedule belonged to forces larger than any individual relationship could fully absorb. Children grew through moments he was not always present for, not from lack of love, but from the simple arithmetic of a life that had placed extraordinary demands on his time for so long that the habit of absence became structural even when it was not intended. He has spoken honestly about the distance this created and about the work required to close it, which is a kind of honesty that does not make headlines the way his playing statistics did, but means considerably more. The losses of both his stepfather and his biological father marked a different kind of turning point. His stepfather, Sergeant Philip Harrison, had been the disciplining, structuring force of his early life, the man who turned raw talent and energy into something directed and purposeful. His presence had been a grounding influence, a moral compass, a steady reference point. His death removed something that could not be replaced by success or money or fame. The biological father whose absence during childhood had left wounds that never fully closed was a more complicated loss. Grief tangled with unresolved questions. Sadness mixed with a particular confusion that comes from mourning someone whose presence was always inconsistent. Losing both of them in relatively close succession forced him into a kind of private reckoning that public life rarely prepares anyone for, regardless of how famous or accomplished they are. Who are you without the people who first defined who you were? What does it mean to forgive someone who was not there in the ways you needed them to be? Those questions do not get answered in press conferences or business deals. They get worked through in quiet moments, often uncomfortably, over long periods of time. What has emerged from all of this is a version of Shaquille O'Neal that the basketball highlights never had room for. He has spoken publicly about rebuilding his relationships with his children, about slowing down enough to be genuinely present rather than physically nearby, while mentally somewhere else. He has talked about health management not as a compromise, but as a new kind of discipline, one that requires the same consistency and commitment that his career once demanded, but directed inward rather than outward. The physical limitations imposed by his hip replacement and his ongoing health management are real and permanent. But they have also clarified something about what daily life is actually for when the championships have already been won and the business empire is already built. His appearance at public events and media appearances still carries the unmistakable weight of someone who dominated an era. The nickname Superman persists because a career that earned it was genuinely extraordinary. But he has said himself, in various ways across various interviews, that the nickname no longer tells a whole story about who he is. Real superheroes in a human sense do not escape the consequences of their own history. They carry those consequences forward and figure out how to live meaningfully inside them. The victories he is working toward now are not measured in championship rings or earnings reports. They are measured in whether his joints allow him to move comfortably through a day, whether the medical equipment gets him through a night's sleep safely, whether his children feel genuinely known by their father rather than simply proud of him from a distance. The young athletes who grow up studying his statistics and his highlights are looking at a record of what his body and his talent could produce under the conditions of professional sport at the highest level. What those numbers cannot show is the cost that accumulates behind them, or the particular kind of courage required to face that cost honestly rather than retreating behind the mythology of greatness. Shaquille O'Neal spent 19 seasons making basketball look effortless. He has spent the years since retirement learning that the effortlessness was never free, and that the real work of his life was always going to begin when the game ended. He is doing that work now, one careful step at a time, with the same basic stubbornness that once made him impossible to move off the block. The opponent has changed. The commitment has not.